let me, Anushka know. All right. As we get started, I just wanted to introduce who we are. So this webinar is brought to you by a collaboration between SAAPRI, and I'll talk a little bit about SAAPRI, and then UIC's Indian Pharmacist Group, and Celia is here representing them, and she'll kind of give you an overview of what they are and who they are and what they do. So my name is Prottusha. I'm the Health Equity Fellow at SAAPRI. I'm currently a fourth year MD MBA student at Northwestern as well. So really passionate about health equity and kind of healthcare in general. SAAPRI stands for the South Asian American Policy and Research Institute, and we're a nonprofit, nonpartisan organization. We were established in 2001, and our ultimate goal is really to use research to form equitable and socially responsible policy recommendations for legislatures. And very quickly, we're also part of this group called the Asian Health Coalition, or the AHC. It's this big group of organizations that are committed to advancing health equity in minority populations. Specifically, we focus on South Asians, and it's part of the All of Us research program. I won't get into details of that now, but feel free to check out the websites below or let us know if you have any questions about this. And I'll give it to Celia.
Hey everyone, my name is Celia Matthew, and I'm the Community Outreach Chair for the Association of Indian Pharmacists in America at UIC's Retsky College of Pharmacy. We're a group of South Asian pharmacy students who are dedicated to developing professional and cultural values in our members. And we also educate our members on the various roles of pharmacists and find different ways to serve our community through things like this fundraiser and um, this the fundraiser and this webinar. And when discussing with SAPRI about topics for this webinar, we gravitated towards neurodivergence because it's such an underrepresented topic in our South Asian community, and it's still considered taboo and often something that people may feel that they must hide. So we really wanted to shift this narrative and bring more light to this topic. So during this presentation, we'll be covering three different topics within neurodivergence and hearing from many different speakers. The topics that we'll be focusing on are autism, attention deficient hyperactivity disorder or ADHD, and obsessive compulsive disorder or OCD.
So we're going to get started and talk about autism, which is our first section of the evening. And Celia, you can take it away.
I was like, hi everyone. So I'm also part of AIPhA, and my name is Katie. I am currently a second year pharmacy student at UIC, and I am going to be giving a brief overview on our first topic, which is autism. So autism generally appears before the age of 3. It can impact social interaction, communication skills, and cognitive function. And autism is often accompanied with other comorbid medical conditions such as allergies, asthma, epilepsy, bowel disease, GI disorders, vitamin and mineral deficiencies, and food sensitivities. And frequently, these other comorbid medical conditions go undiagnosed, and they can cause or exacerbate symptoms of autism. And in 2022, a study was done by the National Autistic Society, which found that South Asian children are often diagnosed with autism at significantly lower rates compared to their white counterparts. And because of stigma, there is minimal research on the prevalence of autism spectrum disorder in South Asians. And some other important things to note are that early and individualized treatment is important to keep co-conditions under control and avoid exacerbating symptoms. And while there's no cure for autism, we can still treat an individual's comorbid conditions and symptoms. And some examples of ways to do this are by going to occupational therapy, which can help with activities of daily living and sensory sensitivities, and speech and language therapy, which can help with communication skills. And there are also antipsychotic medications like risperidone and aripiprazole, which have been approved for autism to help reduce hyperactivity and irritability as well.
All right, thank you for that overview. So now we're going to get to hear from for South Asian speakers on autism and their experiences with it. So for our speakers, just as like a quick how we're going to run this. So I will ask some questions, and then whenever you answer the question for the first time, just feel free to introduce yourself, give us a little overview of who you are. That way, we don't spend a lot of time with the introductions, and we can really focus on hearing your guys' firsthand experience. So my first question is going to be for Ranjit Singh. And my question for you is, how do you think autism or kind of the condition has impacted either how people view you or other people that you know who have autism within the South Asian community?
Thank you. I just want to say I'm Ranjit Singh. We're South Milwaukee, and I do a lot of work in mental health and DEI advocacy. I'm a speaker, and to talk about how autism affects how people affect me and how it affects others in the community. It's a very huge matter. Like it impacts a lot because of the cultural norms like the high power distance hierarchical model or collectivist model. Like as as an autistic person, like I'm not I really don't care too much for like hierarchy between people, but in the culture it is very hierarchical, and because like I don't always respect that, I'm always find myself being treated pretty poorly and bullied and being on the receiving end of a lot of undue aggression. And especially if the so-called higher person, I don't even know who that person is. It's not told. Like I'm expected to know this, like I'm expected to know things indirectly, which is very hard when you're autistic. And especially being in a collectivist society where we're supposed to put aside our needs for others. It's very hard to, because being autistic, we have the condition, we are the marginalized ones. And because that it is very hard to find acceptance and belonging, because the judgment is so high. Even if it's a situation like we're in school or at work, like oftentimes there it's like social skills are a big part of like who you are, and and unfortunately it defines your worth a lot. And fortunately, struggling with autism, we struggle there, so we're seen as less important people, and at times like a bully magnet almost. And it is a very hard experience where we are treated like lesser beings by someone who thinks they're better, someone like people who even preach to me, we're all equal, like when I disagree with them. And I'm like, this is not equality or equity to just throw me down because I was born with a condition they don't have. And yet because of this hierarchical mindset, these people think they're better, like all their thoughts and assumptions are fact, and I'm supposed to just deal with it and get over it. And it's already hard for people who don't have autism, or people who are autistic in like an American community, but seems like it's a double whammy being autistic in the South Asian community.
Thank you for sharing. That sounds really hard. I'd love to hear a little bit more from Preeti, and maybe talk about your experience with autism. Does it compare to what Ranjit is saying, or just we'd love to hear more from you.
Yeah, sure. So, hi everyone. I'm Preeti Kalra from the suburbs of Chicago. I'm actually a pharmacist by training. So, hello to my fellow pharmacists on this call, but been practicing for about now 7 years. So, for me, autism is a very new diagnosis. I got neuropsych testing done back in 2022. And kind of what drove me into getting neuropsych testing done was because growing up, I had just always felt a little different, but my parents didn't really know anything about it. I grew up in the 90s, and at that time, there wasn't that much awareness, right? So, and I'm a very hyperverbal person. I was always very social in school, loved talking, but I think media has really portrayed autism as being this one kind of presentation. And I think growing up, it did a disservice to all of us who maybe didn't present it with a classical, presentation, right? Like nonverbal or very shy, timid. And it's like I was just a very verbal and talkative person growing up, but I did have certain issues, like fine motor skills was really hard for me, still struggle with it. Fine motor skills, just some social awkwardness, definitely eye contact. Sometimes, for me, like too much eye contact, right? Sometimes I'll be intently staring at someone when I'm talking, So that's something I've noticed about myself, and that's kind of what drew me into getting diagnosed with it. Like growing up, like having things very orderly, or and it relates to executive functioning as well. But so for me, the sensory issues and the fine motor skills, for me, that's how I kind of presented with it. But again, I think especially for women, it kind of falls through the cracks, right? For girls, because especially if you're social, you're very outgoing, you have friends, like it can be really easily missed. And in my case, it was. And but I always did feel weird, like relating to what Ranjit was saying, like I felt very like a big outlier from the South Asian community, because again, in our community, if you're different than everyone else, you're kind of shut aside or you're ridiculed, right? Or, growing up, but that's how I felt. And so I didn't have many South Asian friends growing up as a result, because if you're a little different, if you kind of handle situations a little differently, or, there is some fundamental difference, then you're kind of shut aside, and we're a very collective culture. So that's basically my experience with autism in a nutshell. Again, for me, it's a very new diagnosis. So it's something I'm still trying to learn about myself and how I kind of present with it.
Mm-hmm. Murnal, I'm actually also curious to kind of hear your perspective. And, as women, like, do you feel like Preeti shared some similar things that you've experienced, or whatever you think?
Yes, and first of all, let me say that my brother was diagnosed at the age of 2. Today, he's an adult, has the language of a small child, and is going to live with my parents for the rest of his life. I think that he kind of exemplifies what a typical version of autism looks like, which is why he didn't go missed, and his limitations and need for support are significant compared to my own. I think for me, everything was chalked up to I'm not trying hard enough, whether it be for my social anxiety and difficulty making friends, or my academic related struggles with things like following instructions, missing directions, not turning in homework in time, that kind of thing. And then also my uneven talent profile. I was quite good when it came to things like reading, writing, spelling, things involving memorization of facts. Not so good with math, science, things that are theoretical, abstract, require the ability to read between the lines and understand things that aren't stated, type thing. This translated to socializing too. And I think that where the double whammy that I'm seeing is that when you're bicultural, you have to navigate social norms between a multitude of cultures. And I think that navigating social norms and having a lower capacity for nonverbal comprehensions is one of the biggest limitations in autism. Of like, what is nonverbal comprehension? The ability to read body language, facial expressions, hand gestures. Studies show that 70% of communications is nonverbal, no matter what culture you come from. But what they don't tell you is that it's more for neurotypical people. I'm sure if autistic people ruled the world and everyone else was different, it would be flipped. So long story short, I think that I was stuck in a realm of too normal to be different, too different to be normal. In both cultures alike. And I think that, again, the double whammy within South Asian culture is coming from a collectivistic culture. So collectivistic meaning you belong to something greater than you. Your tribe, your identity belongs to your tribe, not to yourself, type thing. And then all of us are familiar, I hope, with the what will people say. And I think this is how my difference is treated. And I would hear phrases like that in the household, even if I didn't have a formal diagnosis. And I think that that is kind of where I was seen as an oddball in a way people couldn't quite put their finger on in South Asian crowds and not South Asian crowds in a sense too.
Yeah, thank you for sharing. It sounds like, making that balance is really tough, and it can be even tougher if you're not neurotypical. Um, so Asha, I know you're an occupational therapist, and I'd love to hear, what kinds of things do you see in your patients, or what kinds of things maybe have you seen that have been helpful to your patients with autism?
Yeah. So hi everybody. My name is Asha. I am a pediatric occupational therapist in the suburbs of Illinois. So I primarily treat in a program called Early Intervention that allows me to work with children who are ages 0 to 3, but I often now do work with children older than 3, all the way up until like 9, 10, 11, 12. Since I'm now working in a job that allows me to be in EI, but also in a clinic setting. And so oftentimes what ends up happening is when I have South Asian families, there is a lack of there's a sense, I should say, of unfamiliarity because there's not actually a word in like Hindi or in most South Asian languages that means autism. There's also there's often a lot of colloquial words that are used to refer to like the symptoms or the presentation of autism, right? And so a lot of times it's this brand new thing that South Asian families have not seen or heard of. And so it's kind of an introduction while trying not to allow the fear or the stigma to kind of cloud the perception and kind of cloud the perceived futures of the children that I'm working with from the family's purview, right? And so oftentimes it's a lot of education, it's a lot of awareness building and things like that. In the context of my job, oftentimes once families kind of realize what's going on, or they kind of like have to start processing the grief or the reality around autism, and a potential diagnosis of autism. And the reason I say grief is I think that again, there's a lot of the fear, the stigma, the shame that exists, and kind of also more so again, just like what is going to happen to my child, right? Like, how is my child going to get through school and education? How are they going to acquire a career? How are they going to, achieve a marriage and then have kids and things like that and find their place in the community? And I oftentimes find myself using what's called a neurodivergent affirming practice. And so what that means, it's a fairly new model, probably in the last like 4 to 5 years, it's really come out. And there's been a lot of research, a lot of doing ed to train providers and train parents and, even teach folks themselves. But essentially that neurodivergent affirming framework talks through how do you look at, diagnosis of not only autism, but, under the umbrella of neurodivergency falls a lot of the diagnoses, right? So how do you look at these diagnoses and these lived experiences even as something that you learn to kind of help clients and their caregivers, their families, their friends, etc. Really support and really participate in, right? How do you find ways to kind of modify the environment in order to make it the most inclusive and the most conducive to the lived experiences of clients and individuals with autism, right? And so, in my experience, I've seen, like, for example, I just talked to the school district of one of my South Asian families today because they had my family come in and they evaluated the child from the school district. And they were like, hey, like, mom and dad seemed really, like, just not with it. They were really withdrawn, really shut down. What's going on? And I was like, well, the client just got a diagnosis of autism, right? And so, there's a lot of fear. There's a lot of, grief and anxiety that comes with, like, that transition in, right? So we have to be really supportive. We have to be very culturally relevant, really trauma informed. And so oftentimes I'm not only educating parents on kind of how to look at autism as not this thing that needs to be cured or remedied or rehabilitated, right? We learn to first accept and we look at like, the strengths and the brighter side of it, right? So many of my clients that have autism are brilliant. They're so sharp with their numbers and their ideas. And once you figure out ways to really, shape and help them like come up with ideas on their own and then execute them, right? You see some really brilliant, really great ideas. And I think that, just figuring out ways to really look at it in a more positive light, in a more accepting light, is where I kind of come in with my practice. And in addition, I do work on all the clinical side of things like sensory processing and attention and fine motor skills, et cetera. But typically I'm trying to find ways to not only treat with that neurodivergent, culturally relevant, trauma-informed lens, to provide education to all around me, whether that's parents, caregivers, or other providers that are often treating with me.
Yeah. Yeah, thank you. It sounds like a really kind of comprehensive approach, and I'm glad to hear we have this new framework to kind of look at autism. I want to make sure we get to the other section, so I'm just going to share my screen again so we can talk about our second section of the night. Alrighty, so now we're going to talk about ADHD, and I will let the UIC team take over.
Good evening, everyone. My name is Jovita Johnson, and I'm currently a second-year student here at UIC's Retzke College of Pharmacy. And as I've been introduced, today I'll be discussing attention deficit hyperactivity disorder, otherwise known as ADHD, with a focus on its impact within South Asian communities. ADHD is a neurodevelopmental disorder that affects both children and adults, with symptoms typically revolving around these three aspects: inattention, hyperactivity, and impulsivity. These symptoms can interfere with an individual's day-to-day life, particularly in aspects such as academics, work, and social relationships. ADHD is one of the most common mental health conditions affecting children globally, but it often goes underdiagnosed and untreated in South Asian populations, and this is due to a variety of factors, including persistent cultural stigmas, limited awareness, and systemic barriers to mental health care. Especially in the South Asian culture, behavioral issues related to ADHD are frequently misunderstood. Children may be labeled as lazy, naughty, or disobedient, which presents significant challenges when it comes to seeking and accessing appropriate treatment for ADHD. These negative perceptions are often a result of the high value placed on academic achievement and compliance with social norms in South Asian culture. So as a result, ADHD symptoms may be dismissed as personal failings instead, unfortunately leading families to avoid seeking professional help. The first line of treatment for ADHD is typically pharmacological, with psychostimulants being the most commonly prescribed medications. Two main medications used to treat ADHD include methylphenidate, which you might know by the brand names of Ritalin or Concerta, and amphetamines, also known as Adderall or Vyvanse. These medications work by increasing the levels of neurotransmitters, such as dopamine and norepinephrine in the brain, which helps to improve focus, attention, and reduce hyperactive behavior. Non-pharmacological treatments also play an essential role in managing ADHD. Cognitive behavioral therapy is one such treatment, which helps individuals with ADHD to develop coping strategies and address negative thought patterns. Parent training is another important component, especially with children, as it equips parents with the skills to manage quote unquote challenging behaviors and create a supportive environment for their growth and development. Social skills training can also be helpful in addressing difficulties with social relationships and communication. So in conclusion, ADHD presents significant challenges for South Asian populations, both in terms of diagnosis and treatment. Cultural stigmas and systemic barriers continue to contribute to underdiagnosis and lack of treatment, but there is an opportunity to change this narrative by continuing to increase awareness and continuing to dismantle misconceptions. Thank you.
Okay, thank you for that overview. And now I'm excited to hear from our speakers. So I'm going to stop sharing my screen so we can see our speakers. And my first question is actually directed at Mr. Dash. I understand that you were recently diagnosed with ADHD. I'd love to hear a little bit more about the process and what that was like, as well as kind of how is it impacting your work, if at all.
Hi, glad to be here and sharing my experience. Just for context, I think I'm from Columbus, Ohio, Anushka's dad. And also from a context of ADHD, I'm 52, right? I don't know if that's important to some of the really learned people here who know about, I guess, mental health. So I got diagnosed a year back, and I guess like millions of me, unfortunately, who are not only uneducated, but also ill-informed about mental health issues and continue to be so. I was the same, have gone through life not knowing that I had anything which is different than anybody else, right? I have to be very thankful to my counselor who helped and pushed for my diagnosis for ADHD last year. And that has really changed my life in a lot of ways. It took me a few months to learn that what I knew as normal, and I'll actually share a small joke that will kind of, make sense to some of the people here in this call. My children always used to say, "Oh, if you ask dad something in the evening, that's not the right time, and but it's better to talk with him at 6 a.m. in the morning, right?" And I used to think in a way that that's because you're tired at the end of the day, and it's anything important supposed to discuss at during the start of the day or during the middle of the day. But with my ADHD diagnosis and so many discussions that have happened since then with my counselor, with my doctor, I've realized that again, I'm still not very educated on ADHD, but it's based on my own experience that you get tired during the day. And by the evening, you're in a state where all you want to do is be left alone, right? Relax, and then think about the next day, right? So in my, I think, life, the way I think I have now that I'm kind of trying to understand and still learning about this, I have always adapted to having ADHD, which means that I've made that extra effort. If I have missed deadlines, if I have missed stuff, because I was thinking about 15 things as an example at the same time. I used to think that, oh, if I'm doing one thing and I think about 14 other things, I must be parking that in my brain. Then I realized, no, I don't park that. Now when I read about it, I don't park it. I concurrently and parallelly think about all those 15 things together, which puts a lot of strain. And so because I think the medications were displayed, so I take Adderall. The way it has affected me is that I do not feel as tired at the end of the day. I do not feel as irritated with colleagues, and I do not feel irritated in stressed out situations. So it's definitely helped me a lot to the extent that I think my kids were joking the first 4 or 5 months after my diagnosis that, dad seems to think that Adderall is like a God gift, which, to be honest, it has been for me. Yeah, I mean, that's me. And I think hats off to I know some of the counselors are here in this call. So hats off to that community, the job that they do, right? And as I said, I got diagnosed because of the push from my counselor.
Thank you for sharing, that long process, kind of living with it throughout your life and maybe not realizing that your normal wasn't maybe, someone else's normal. Zainab, I would love to hear a little bit more about your experience with your clients and what being South Asian has kind of impacts on your clients and kind of what you've seen in your clinical experience.
So I'm Zainab Mansha. I am a mental health therapist and I specialize in working with neurodivergent clients. So the majority of my clients do have ADHD. A lot of them have not been diagnosed until they start to see me, and then I usually recommend that they go and get official testing, which is done by a psychologist. And so there are a few different things that I think are noteworthy that I've seen working with South Asian clients who have ADHD. I think one of the biggest ones, as one of our other speakers mentioned, was being diagnosed very late. A lot of them are not diagnosed until they're adults, and a lot of that is because people with ADHD do tend to have high intelligence. Along with, South Asian culture, there's a lot of expectations and perfectionism. So even if people are having some of these issues or symptoms, they're kind of masking and pushing themselves to overcompensate for their ADHD through excessive perfectionism. So a lot of times we'll see that they don't get diagnosed until there is a push from many different people. And one of the things that I've seen, at least, is that a lot of times they are more likely to go through the process of getting diagnosed or getting on medication when they see a mental health professional from the South Asian background because it allows them to feel more understood. And even seeing that, like, there are other people from our culture who are experiencing the same thing, and it takes away some of that stigma and even shows role models of people who are successful and they have education, high levels of education, and they're very high functioning, and they're able to understand that ADHD is not, it doesn't mean that you're lazy. It doesn't mean that something's wrong with you. I think that's one of the big things that I try to work on with my clients, through therapy and through coaching, is helping them see the strengths that come with ADHD, which a lot of times people will focus on the negatives that come with it, the things that, you do need medication or therapy to work on, developing different skills or even helping you focus. But some of the strengths that come with ADHD are that a lot of my clients with ADHD tend to be very creative. If they're interested in something, they can hyper focus for a very long time. And so that's one of the things where in the South Asian culture, uh, there's pressure to be in certain careers and certain fields. And people with ADHD, a lot of times, they're going to be a lot more unhappy in a career that isn't of interest to them, but they might still go down that path because they feel pressure from either the family or community. And so we see a lot of the symptoms that come with ADHD can be anxiety and depression. And we see a lot of those symptoms going away when people with ADHD are working on those symptoms and also they're doing something or they're in a field that they actually enjoy versus, one that they feel pressured to be in.
Yeah, that's some really helpful insight, to see that maybe people are masking for a long time. And I also love you bringing up focusing on the positive as well instead of just the negative. Preeti, I believe you also kind of wanted to talk a little bit about ADHD and maybe share some things on the topic.
Yeah, sure. I've been diagnosed with ADHD. It's been roughly approximately 13 years ago I was diagnosed. And my story was I was actually in medical school when I was diagnosed. I got into med school and I was there for 3 months and hell broke loose. I did really well in undergrad and all of a sudden, bam, like I was really, really struggling. And so my parents, I'm an only child. So my parents, they just took me I got neuropsych testing done, and that's how I first got diagnosed with ADHD. But after the diagnosis, I think things made so much more sense. I felt like I was living, like my brain, I was just living with this brain fog all my life. And that's just the best way I can explain it. And then all of a sudden, when I started taking the medication, it's like my brain just woke up and it's like glasses for my brain. That's probably the best analogy I can use. So that's just a little bit of how I was diagnosed with it. Of course, like coming from a South Asian background, like my parents, they still don't, they never liked it that I take medication for it, but it helps me function. And when, growing up, like to do just the simplest things, right? Like get a glass of water, like, set the dinner table, like just things used to require so much effort. And I think the reason I was able to cope with it this many years, because growing up in a South Asian household, parents having very supportive parents, micromanaging everything, they helped me with the executive functioning aspect. So that's why I was able to make it all the way and, complete pharmacy school. And now I'm a practicing pharmacist. But it took a lot of external support as well as a lot of internal hard work to get where I am today. And so while I feel like, yeah, I wish, growing up in South Asian culture, there was more awareness. But I also think because how much our parents support us, I was able to get through it and cope with it. But yes, I did at the expense of many areas of my life. So now I look back in hindsight, like, yeah, the symptoms were there, impulsivity, not more like how it presents with boys like, oh, running around, being loud. But me, it was mainly like talking in class, blurting out answers, when the teacher used to call on me. And just being very hyperverbal and impulsive. And, so that's kind of what I saw, like, looking back, that the signs were there. But again, growing up in the South Asian community and having that external support system with my parents managing everything, I didn't have to worry as much. The executive function demand wasn't as much until I reached medical school, moved out of state, and it was just the perfect storm. So I think in my story, it was kind of difficult though, because again, it was a very, very stringent and stressful atmosphere that I was diagnosed in. And, it was hard because we're a very, model minority myth, right? We're a very high achieving kind of minority group that we give so much emphasis on academics. And it was a time in my life where it was really hard because I'm like, I had to find out all the way till then. And but in hindsight, I'm like, everything, worked out for the best. And I just know more things about myself than I previously did. So.
Yeah, thank you for sharing. I'm glad to hear that your parents were such a big support throughout that process and that you were able to kind of, have glasses for your brain. I like that analogy. I want to make sure we have enough time for OCD, so I am going to move on to the next section. Oops. All right. And for OCD, I'm going to hand it off to the UIC team once again.
Hi everyone, my name is Ramya Kulagani and I'm currently a third-year student at the UIC College of Pharmacy. So I'm just going to give you all a brief overview of obsessive compulsive disorder, or OCD. So this condition is characterized by obsessions and compulsions, or sometimes a combination of both. So obsessions are more the mental aspects, so thoughts, images, or impulses that occur repeatedly and feel outside of someone's control, while compulsions are the tangible behaviors or thoughts that a person uses to neutralize or counteract an obsession. So, for example, an obsession could be just worrying about cleanliness or germs or like getting an illness. And then the compulsion would be to excessively wash your hands or have a specific cleaning ritual to kind of neutralize getting that illness or sickness. So usually OCD starts between late childhood and young adulthood. This is not to say this can't occur later in life, but it is more rare. And then for a diagnosis, although we all can have obsessions and compulsions from time to time, for accurate diagnosis, the cycle must be so extreme that it consumes a lot of a person's time. And in the South Asian community, Asian Americans are very underrepresented in clinical trials and treatment programs for OCD, since traditionally these studies are with white middle-aged males, so it's hard to get an accurate representation for South Asians. But it has been found that the first-line treatment is selective serotonin reuptake inhibitors, and these work by increasing the level of the neurotransmitter serotonin in the brain, which regulates mood, anxiety, and other emotional functions. And some of these examples are fluoxetine, fluvoxamine, paroxetine, sertraline, and citalopram, with their brand names or more common names listed next to them. And it's also been shown that cognitive behavioral therapy has been very effective along with the medication treatment for helping OCD, along with exposure and response prevention.
Thank you for that overview and kind of defining what an obsession and what a compulsion is. I think that's really helpful to understand. Now I'd love to hear from our speakers, so I'm going to stop sharing my screen again. And I'm sorry if you hear the ambulance in the background. So we have Zainab and Mariam speaking to us about OCD. I want to start off with Mariam and just ask about what your experience has been like with OCD, South Asian, and more about that.
Okay, hi everyone. I'm Mariam. Thank you so much for having me on. Very excited to be a part of this. Yeah, so my lived experience with it. For a long time, I was not diagnosed with OCD, but I was diagnosed with other mental health conditions, which is interesting given the South Asian background because my dad is a psychiatrist and there's a lot of providers in my family and in my community, many of whom are also psychiatrists. And so what's interesting is I don't share the experience that maybe other South Asians have had to deal with not receiving psychiatric assistance earlier on. But I more so had to deal with the harms of the medical model of disability, meaning that my other diagnoses of anxiety and depression from a young age were kind of seen by my community as something that, if you just take medication for this, then you'll improve and like your productivity will improve, etc. And so like for OCD, which I strongly identify with because I've had it since I was a child, there are certain symptoms that I have that might look like I'm performing really well. And so then it becomes a sort of invisibilized disability because if you're looking at it from a capitalist point of view that, disability is only a disability if it affects your productivity, then you're not really considered disabled until you're burned out from your own mind's tendencies. So that also was something that was not really noticed by people around me until it was like too late and it started to affect my academic experience. So I guess that's kind of a short introduction to that.
Yeah, thank you for running through that. It's yeah, definitely interesting to hear your perspective as someone, who had maybe more exposure to mental health professionals kind of throughout your life. Zainab, I'd love to hear more about what it's like for your clients who have OCD and what kinds of things you've seen be helpful to them.
Yeah, so some of the things that I've noticed, similar to what we talked about earlier, there's a lot of shame and secrecy, and that comes from the intrusive thoughts that can be there with OCD. And these intrusive thoughts are, they're not often things that the person actually wants to do or things that they're interested in, but they just come to their mind. And so people have trouble sharing taboo topics that they're thinking about, and this could include like harm, things that are, of sexual nature, things like that. In especially, I would say Pakistani culture, where a lot of people are Muslim. So it's things that a lot of my clients they internalize, and they don't even know how to share it when they're in therapy sessions because they feel embarrassed by it. So that leads to them being isolated, and they don't know how to seek help because they think that they're going to be judged for it due to religious reasons. And then on top of that, in the South Asian community, there's cultural practices such as evil eye or nazar. A lot of people, they'll engage in excessive praying, thinking that that'll prevent bad luck, but a lot of times that can actually reinforce OCD tendencies. So one thing that's really important with a lot of my clients that have OCD is incorporating faith-based practices because that's going to resonate with them more. And so one of the types of therapy that I use with clients, and it's pretty much the golden standard for OCD, is exposure and response therapy. So pretty much what that is you're exposed to the thing that is affecting you. So whether it's thing that you're thinking about or something that you're obsessively feeling like you have to do, you're kind of exposed to it in a safe environment in order to prevent it from becoming or in order to relieve the anxiety that comes with it. And so I think one of the things that's helpful for the community or family members in order to understand OCD better is just teaching them more about what OCD is and showing that it's not just someone being a clean freak or someone just, overthinking about things. There's an actual issue that's going on there, and validating those struggles instead of shaming the people that are struggling.
Yeah, thank you for sharing that. And I'm actually, it's really interesting for me to hear that faith-based practice is something that really works well for your South Asian patients. I've seen patients with OCD before, and that's never, even come to our brains as we treat them. All right, so Anushka is spotlighting all of us right now because we're going to transition into our Q&A portion of the evening. So if you didn't already see her message, please feel free to unmute and ask a question, or you can submit a question in the chat if you don't feel comfortable, or if you would prefer to message that question to me or Anushka and have one of us ask on your behalf. We are also happy to do so. So whoever wants to go.
Yeah, anyone can unmute themselves. I want to make sure that everyone's feeling comfortable, but I actually can start off with a question. When I was hearing you guys talk, I started writing down questions for each section. So I'll start with, first of all, autism, and anyone can unmute themselves and answer. It doesn't have to be just the speakers. People who are attending are also encouraged to share their experience. I forgot to introduce myself. I'm Anushka, Programs and Operations Person at SAAPRI. I was the one who worked with Celia and Prottusha in the beginning to sort of host this event. We were trying to host something in January, and we were trying to think of topics to sort of talk about. And as Celia mentioned before, I was actually taking my Adderall when we were having that meeting. So I was like, oh, well, actually, we don't talk about neurodivergence at all. So that's something I feel very passionate about, since I do have ADHD and I was also diagnosed pretty late. So that's where the genesis of this webinar is, and I'm glad we're having it. But yeah, I guess my question, first of all, for autism is, I guess my impression growing up, I didn't know much about mental health, let alone autism or neurodivergence. I think I came across neurodivergence as a word like pretty much last year. So my impression, I think, growing up with autism specifically was Dustin Hoffman from Rain Man. I'm not sure if you guys know of the movie, but I think my impression was that if you're autistic, you have to be a genius and you have to go to MIT and know a lot of math numbers and number crunching and I think that's what my expectation was. So I guess people who are autistic, do you guys face this sort of pressure to be geniuses, or people expect you to be really good at math or something because that's how the media portrays it?
Yes, and I would say that I feel like the media, not just the media, but in the 90s, if you walk into special ed school systems, most kids with an autism diagnosis would be either a savant or a nonverbal or a very semi-verbal white American cisgender white male who sits in the corner, rocks back and forth, bangs his head against the wall when he gets upset, can never have the capacity to live independently type thing. And I think that's because, so when I try to tell people that I'm on the spectrum and people say things like, why were you diagnosed with that? I'll say that, I have a lot of difficulty reading social cues. I'll say that neuropsychiatric testing itself shows that I'm at the 5th percent for nonverbal communication for my age group. And that's low enough to be learning disabled. And it's always met with, but you seem fine, as though it's a compliment. And I think that is because they think that autism is the image that I just mentioned right now. And I think that they also think that everyone has difficulty reading social cues. And then to that, I'd be like, everybody pees when it's happening 50 times a day. It's a problem.
Yeah, thanks for adding that. No, I think that's good to know. Anyone else who wants to chime in? Ranjit or Preeti or anyone else on the call is willing to share their experience?
I'll just say that a lot of times, using that neurodivergent affirming lens I was mentioning earlier that I usually use in my clinical practice, is I will often reference individuals in history that have shared their experiences with being diagnosed with autism anywhere in the lifespan, but have been a major part of history, in order to kind of convey both sides of what it can look like when it comes to having a diagnosis of autism. So, for example, One of my favorite books to reference is called Through Your Eyes, and it's the story of the gentleman who made the guitars for the band Kiss, like the flaming guitars. He was not diagnosed with autism until he was in his late 50s, early 60s. And back then, when he got diagnosed, it was still Asperger's. But oftentimes I'll kind of use that as a frame of reference to kind of talk about, like, it doesn't always look like, a very savant or a very severe or impacted experience. There are instances in which, an individual who has autism can have a choice in terms of like how they live and where they live, and really have that access to autonomy, even though I know that's not every person's lived experience, right? But it is a very common question that comes up in clinical practice as to like what, based on my experience as a professional, like has been like what is typically the outlook for clients.
Yeah, thanks for adding that. No, I think there's definitely like the sort of pressure that you guys just mentioned, especially with the model minority myths too with South Asians. I feel like that can definitely add a lot more pressure. I'll kind of segue into my other question that kind of relates to ADHD. So, Mr. Das earlier, he's my father. I asked him to join the panel because I thought he could add to the getting diagnosed late and how do you deal with that diagnosis, especially in your corporate job and your family. So I guess my question for Zanab and my dad, and I think everyone else, is that how do you deal with talking to your parents and friends about it? Because especially in our Desi community, a lot of the times these things, like you guys mentioned, we look down upon it. I think a lot of times the Hindi word is they're pagal, they're crazy, or we're all crazy. So I think there's a lot of stigma attached to it. But how do you actually, as a kid especially, go up to your parents and say, Dad or Mom, like I might have like I need to go to the doctor. I have these things. Like I'm not pagal, I'm not crazy. How do you approach that conversation with your kids or with your parents? And then also, how do you approach that conversation with maybe your friends and kids at that age? So like, Dad, you mentioned that you got diagnosed late. Did you have difficulty opening up to your friends about it? Did you end up opening up to your friends about it? Was there some stigma attached to it? Do you like to keep it sort of private because people have some sort of weird notions about it? How do you guys sort of navigate that? You can expand on that, and then Zana, maybe you can expand on your perspective as a counselor on how you advise your patients.
I'll say this from my childhood, right? Growing up in a small city in India, I don't think there was any awareness, right? I did not know anything to do with mental health issues. And as you said, anybody who was visually or seemed different was termed crazy, right? And that was the maximum extent of any discussions around it. So growing up, as I said, I never realized I had anything different. It was only when the diagnosis was done that I have gone back and thought about so many things that I would have done differently, would have been easier for me had I been diagnosed earlier. About talking to my friends after I have been diagnosed, while by nature I'm kind of open and blunt, so I don't mind sharing. But within the South Asian community, at least from people of like my friends typically are from Indian origin, even though they have been here like a long time, I do not find still the awareness that where I feel I do share it with them, but it's like their reaction is a nod of the head. Okay. I mean, that's about it, right? Oh, yeah, you've shared. And beyond that, I don't think there's any recognition or any awareness of that, hey, you're facing something, right?
Yeah. Sam, do you want to share? I mean, I have thoughts back and forth. I could have a whole podcast here tonight, but I'll let you share.
Yeah, so while we were talking, I remembered something that I kind of wanted to share. So I was recently speaking to a mental health therapist that lives in Pakistan, and I had shared with her, and I'll share with you guys, I actually have ADHD myself. Um, and, I've dealt with a lot of these things growing up. I didn't get diagnosed until I was starting college. I was 19, and similar to a lot of girls in South Asian culture. I had really great grades. I was always top of my class. And so when I would tell my parents that, hey, like I can't focus, they were like, okay, well, just try harder. And, I had to be the best all the time with the expectations that were put on me. And so I would stay up all night studying because that's the only time my brain would work. And I'd be sitting in class and nothing was really registering. So I didn't get diagnosed until college because that's when I moved away from home. And I didn't have my parents telling me every day, hey, you need to be the best, you need to do this. Um, and that was the point in my life too where I didn't have to ask my parents' permission to go see a doctor. I secretly did it. And I was like, okay, they're not going to believe me and they're not going to think anything is wrong. So I secretly went, I got diagnosed, and I secretly started taking medication. And so all of it, I'm sharing this because this is something I've seen with a lot of my clients who are South Asian. They hide their diagnosis from their parents. They don't get diagnosed until after they're 18, a lot of them, and they hide it. I have some clients that have been for months. Their parents don't know they're in therapy. They don't know they're on medication. It's the same types of fears that people are going to think they're crazy. And so a lot of it for my clients, I do share with them that I have ADHD and it helps them see, oh, well, this girl is, she did her master's program and she's working in this field. And people usually can't tell that I have ADHD until I share it with them. Um, and so they're like, well, you seem so calm. And I'm like, yeah, I worked on a lot of things. And it was because I was able to get a diagnosis, but it took me years after getting a diagnosis to get to this place. So when I was speaking to the therapist who lives in Pakistan, it was funny because I told her I had ADHD, and she was shocked. She goes, "What do you mean you have ADHD?" Like, I was like, why are you so shocked? And she said, well, we're taught that people who have ADHD are dumb. And she was like, and clearly you're not dumb. And I was like, okay, that's a funny thing to say to someone. But again, in our culture, that is a big thing. People don't have good, like, they're not taught really about it. So they don't have that much knowledge. And they just go based off of what, they're seeing in media or anything like that. And it's sad, but I think a lot of it, like what our parents think and what the community thinks, it's not like they want to place judgment. I think they just don't have enough education about it. And so they're trying to make sense of what's going on, but they just don't understand it. And that's why I think providing, uh, these types of things and sharing with people what it looks like and even talking about how common it is and how it is undiagnosed a lot of times, I think is so important in raising this awareness.
I mean, some may say that the DSM-5 is colonial at its core and that it doesn't take into consideration cultural differences when it comes to its labels, and even having labels in the first place can be ableist.
Yeah, and even not only cultural, but gender, because I think someone else was sharing before, but the symptoms do look so different in men and women. And with men, there's a lot of behavioral issues. And so I see clients of all ages, and the boys, I have siblings because it's very genetic. So you'll see a lot of people in a family will have some type of neurodivergent disorder. It might not be the same one, or it might be you have more than one. And you'll see, like, I have siblings who I see as clients, and they'll present so differently. If one of them's a girl and a boy, the boy will be behavioral issues, a lot of complaints from school. The girl is very, like, the talkative is the main thing. They'll talk a lot. Uh, and they'll have a lot of friends, but they're good in school because they're held to higher standards. So they're masking a lot, whereas the guys usually aren't really masking.
Yeah, I think that's a great point. I saw that Miriam and then another person raised their hand, so um, feel free to unmute yourself, Miriam, and then we can have Prashant share as well.
Sure. So I was trying to think about, so revisiting the idea of like approaching mental health from this medical model of disability. As I said in my experience, and this is just me, I have not felt like education necessarily was what my community or family needs to understand this. I think they very much understand the physical manifestations of the mental illness because that's the symptoms that they can recognize as outsiders. I think given that this community has so many medical providers, even those who are psychiatrists or who, understand these official diagnoses, um, in my opinion, there's something a lot deeper that they're not understanding about mental health and mental illness. Um, I believe that this sort of lack of emotional, I don't want to say maturity, but like growth and development that is needed to really understand the full scope of a person who identifies as neurodivergent, I think that's not really there because in my experience, like a lot of times I would feel like my family was kind of tiptoeing around me or like they would try to address certain symptoms as if like this illness is something that I can separate myself from. And I think the reason why I consider it neurodivergence is because I can't do that. And I know some people with OCD, they would prefer to separate themselves from that diagnosis. But for me, it's just been such a transformative, or it's significantly shaped who I am today and how I look at life. And so I think the other sort of elements of that neurodivergence that goes beyond it being a mental illness is something that a lot of people in the South Asian community can't really understand because we don't know how to be like very emotionally open and vulnerable and compassionate, probably because like our communities we're not really given the opportunity to do that earlier in life. Like being a model minority means that you have to adhere to the standards of capitalism in this colonial imperial country where you don't have the luxury of taking care of yourself because if you do, then you're a threat to productivity and then you lose all your income for your family. So I think there's definitely some deeper rooted injustices that affect the ways in which South Asians tend to think about mental illness. Even if they do try to think about it, they still kind of approach it towards the medical model and not look at like the other social aspects of it.
Yeah, no, that's a great point. Prashant, feel free to unmute yourself. I see that you've raised your hand.
I was gonna say that I totally agree with Zainab and Miriam that I actually did the same thing Zainab did where I kind of went to got help behind my parents' back because it's just seen such a stigmatizing like mental health is just seen as such a stigmatizing condition in our community. Like it's funny because when I was diagnosed with anxiety like 5 years, I think 6 years ago, and my parents and my brother, they gave me this advice where they said, "Oh, the best way to get over it is to take a step back and not think it's a big problem." And when I look back, I think that's just awful advice because, like, I see it just like any physical condition. It doesn't really matter if you think it's a big problem or don't think it's a big problem, or in fact, don't even know it's a problem because it's still going to be there. It doesn't make a difference if you just it's not some made up thing in your head. And it's funny because my mother's actually a physician, and I've shadowed with her before, and I've seen her actually tell her patients that have hypertension and diabetes that for them the best way to get over a problem is to accept that it's a problem and really make sure you improve your diet and improve your or taking your medication. So I just find it kind of, I found it really strange and like so that she would say the exact opposite when it comes to mental health. So I pretty much had to do the same thing as Zainab, where I had to kind of like seek, go to therapy and take medication behind my parents' back because I just like I think it's just really seen as kind of an excuse. Like people think because it's mental, like you can just think your way out of it and you're weak if you struggle. But I don't think there's anything we I would say there's nothing weak at all. Like your brain's a body part just like any other part of your body. So yeah, I would. That's why I feel like it's important to get help and not and kind of just ignore the stigma.
I wonder too if it's also because of things like fear of like family or reputation being destroyed or not being able to get you married off, that type of thing.
Yeah,
Yeah,
I actually think so too.
yeah, the married off thing. Oof. Do they see parents love putting that pressure on everyone? I see Shobana mention something in the comments. Shobana, do you want to just read your question out loud, or I can as well. Shobna, by the way, is SAAPRI's executive director, everyone. I can also just read your question out
Yeah, go
loud.
ahead, Anushka.
Okay,
Thank you.
perfect. All right, so thank you for highlighting this important issue, sharing such valuable insights, and amplifying the fact that tackling mental health challenges in the South Asian community requires cultural sensitivity, education, and open conversation to reduce stigma and treat mental health with the same importance as physical health. What do you suggest to be able to better advocate for culturally competent care in addition to what we can do as a family and community? I guess this question's open for anyone who's willing to chime in. I see that people are commenting as well in the chat.
So as an author of 2 books about South Asian mental health, I've heard from a lot of people, because both my books are collections of stories of people with their personal journeys. And first of all, a lot of people feel very strongly about having mental health care providers who are the same ethnicity or religion as them. They feel that being able to do that means that they don't have to spend 30 minutes of an hour-long session, for example, teaching their provider, why does my family think the way they think? But on the flip side, I also did meet some of the storytellers that said that they feel more judged by their community and they would prefer a non-South Asian therapist as a result, for example. So I think that and then there's the movement of decolonizing therapy these days so for example, some people think cognitive behavioral therapy is colonial because some may say that it pathologizes thoughts excessively, and that instead we need to do somatic and body-based therapies more, such as EMDR and brain spotting, mindfulness meditation, and spiritual coaching. And some may say, but then on the other hand, some people may label that cultural appropriation sometimes to go back to the indigenous practices. I don't think that one way is necessarily better than the other way. I think it's about increasing accessibility to all ways and also helping to reduce ableism no matter what community you come from.
Yeah, thank you, Ronald. I see Sean, you raised your hand.
Yeah, hi everyone. My name is Sean. I'm an incoming med student. Just want to say, first of all, that it's been really insightful just to be here to learn about everyone's experience one by one. So that's been really exciting and really helpful. My question is for Mr. Das. I'm not sure if he's still here or if he left. Okay, yes. Yeah. I've a similar experience. My father is also South Asian, and he's a little bit older in his 60s now, but he also got diagnosed with ADHD around the age of 50 as well. I also got diagnosed recently last year, and I'm like 26 now. So my question, like for you, I guess specifically, is I guess getting diagnosed a bit later on in life relative to other people. Has that triggered like a sense of maybe curiosity or other feelings about how your life would have turned out had you been diagnosed earlier, and how do you cope with that?
To be honest, I've been so thankful for many reasons that I've not really thought about, how from a granular perspective, my life would have been different. Because it's kind of hard to think, right? I think from what I've learned a little about ADHD is that I just made up strategies in my life naturally to cope up. And I think that's what possibly would have helped me go higher whichever way in life, right? Like not just like from a job perspective or from a family perspective. But yeah, I definitely do find that even with a very quick, like a short time frame of having started my medication, the difference it has made, it should have made a lot of difference had I been diagnosed at a younger age.
Thank you. Appreciate the answer.
Anyone else have any questions? I actually have one, unless someone's. Oh, Ranjit, go ahead. I see you unmuting yourself.
Yes, I want to say like for what our community can do, and for our community, it's just accept others for being different, like forgetting like this age-old book of laws that we have to follow and expect others to follow that, dropping like this more judgmental attitude of like he's this, she's that, and like finding all these other ways to look down, and just forgetting that and just accepting everyone for, as we all have different very different qualities about us, and some of them are by some of them may not be. It's just accepting everyone for who they are, and I think that also be like just treating others the way we do want to be treated, because I know there are people who want to claim like they're activists for my condition and they're my advocate. Yet if I disagree with some of these people, I'm usually accused of someone I'm not. And I'm usually interrupted and shouted at for it, and sometimes face public humiliation because I challenge someone who believes they know more than me about myself, are those who think advocating for me to come for or throwing me down. And I would say is treat others how we want to be treated, and for others to be mindful that not every South Asian American is from the most privileged background, and there's so much of South Asia's diversity, including neurodiversity as well as all the other diversity categories right here in the United States. And oftentimes the people who we want to be seen as an ally of, they're usually right in front of us. And one of the reasons people don't know it is precisely that they're right in front of us, and there's this idea that all South Asian Americans are from this very privileged background, and that's not the case. We represent all of South Asia's diversity is represented in the diaspora, especially here, and to actually, I say, like, listen to other viewpoints. Like I know a lot of people will preach, listen to other perspectives, but actually practicing that and accepting those who do have the different perspectives, and seeing people who differ from us as our equals, people we can learn from rather than people who we want to teach a lesson to, and just accepting people for who they are and accepting their differences, acknowledging different journeys and life paths.
Yeah. Thank you, Ranjit. I see that. I'm sorry, I missed your question in the chat. I'm so sorry. Do you want to unmute yourself and ask, or?
Hi, yeah. So I have a question for Preeti, because she mentioned that she was a pharmacist. Did getting diagnosed with autism.
I'm sorry. I think your voice is like cutting out and very distant. I'm not sure if that's the case for everyone. Uh,
Can you hear me now?
yes.
Okay, sorry about that. I had a question for Preeti because she mentioned that.
Never mind. I think it went away again. Do you mind if I just read your question out loud for Preeti?
Yeah, that's fine.
Okay, sorry about that. Yeah, for Preeti, I see in the chat, Asara wrote, did getting diagnosed with autism help you with getting any formal or informal accommodations as a pharmacist? And just to add to that, actually, Preeti, I had a question for you, which kind of relates to this. I take Adderall, and I understand that there's a huge misuse of these drugs as well out there in the community, especially in high school and college. I came across a lot of people taking Adderall for exams. I think they'll score 36 on ACT just if they take Adderall. So I think when I started telling people that I take Adderall, people used to think that I'm cheating the system. Did you deal with that? So yeah, I'll let you have it.
Yeah, so to answer the first question, so in my workplace, no, I do not receive any formal accommodations. And I think a lot of people here are pharmacists or in healthcare. And I think this is a whole other conversation, but in healthcare, especially when you're a healthcare worker, there's a whole other dimension of stigma, right? Like, it's sad that we are healthcare workers, we take care of patients every day, but still, like, at work, I'm a little scared, like, what if someone finds out, right? Like, I take ADHD medication. And for the autism piece, though, for me, because I'm a very verbal person, I socially interact with my coworkers. Nobody really can tell. They might think maybe I have some awkward nuisances, right? Or maybe some quirks, but I've really never really came across where like my autism it's very noticeable at work. But as for the ADHD, I've developed strategies like being on my phone too much at work because it's like, it stimulates my brain, right? So then I did an app blocker on my phone, so I'm not staring at my phone when our queue is busy. But I think also working in a very fast pace, I work in patient pharmacy, so working in a very fast paced hospital environment has actually worked in my favor with my ADHD, because then I'm always, constantly doing something, and it's like a fast paced adrenaline kind of environment, and as opposed to, our corporate job where I would be staring at PowerPoint slides or whatever, or reports. So in the autism aspect, no, but in the ADHD, I've tried, like, it's more for myself, like, how do I develop strategies? Because I feel like, especially working in healthcare, I have to keep it very hush hush. And, because there is even a bigger stigma that's not even just being South Asian, but also working in healthcare. And I'm sure other people who are going to healthcare, going to be working in healthcare, can probably relate to that. And in the higher education, yeah, a lot of people do take, unfortunately, they do abuse the ADHD meds. People will take it to stay up all night, because that's really the difference. Like, if you don't have it versus have it, people used to, in my pharmacy school class, they used to take it on, so they can just study all night and, cram before an exam. And it's unfortunate for those of us who really, really need it just to, like, get by and, even out the level, the functioning level. So.
Yeah. Thank you for answering. I know we're coming close to 9:20, but before we end the Q&A, I want to open up to anyone, the speakers also, to give your last remarks. If anyone has any concluding thoughts before we stop the recording. I will stick around after with our team a little bit, so if anyone wants to stick around and have further conversations, I'm always willing to. But I just wanted to let everyone know that this meeting is getting recorded, and it is going to be published on our YouTube channel. So if anyone is uncomfortable with their part getting uploaded on YouTube or any social media, please just email us and we will try our best to edit it out. But anyone have any concluding thoughts before we wrap it up? I think that's it. Okay, well, we'll call it a night. Thank you, everyone, for joining. Thank you, Prottusha. Thank you, Celia, and UIC's team. Thank you to all the speakers for joining us. I think this was a great start to creating some change in our community, and I'm very glad that everyone felt comfortable and vulnerable enough to share their experiences. Thanks, everyone.